Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI.
Starting in late September, young Moroccans took to the streets in cities across the kingdom under the banner GenZ 212, angered by what they see as the kingdom's failing healthcare and education systems, as well as the government's persistent inability to deliver on its development plans and promises. What changes were protesters calling for? How has the government responded so far? And how do Morocco's protests fit into the broader global wave of youth protest movements?
To explore all of these questions and more, we're joined on this week's episode by MEI Senior Fellow Intissar Fakir. Intissar's work mainly focuses on the intersection of political, social, and economic trends in North Africa and the Sahel. She is the author of a recent article published by MEI that delves into the GenZ 212 protests and the underlying factors behind them. We will include a link to her piece in this episode's show notes.
Our listeners can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please do check out MEI's other podcasts as well, Rethinking Democracy, hosted by Gunil Toll, and Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis.
Intissar, welcome to Middle East Focus. It's great to have you back on the program.
Thank you for having me.
So, Intissar, we're recording this on Wednesday, October 29th. Could you bring us up to speed on the situation in Morocco? What has happened and what is the status of the protest movement today?
So the protest movement that started at the end of September with, thousands of protesters across the country with significant momentum and anger has slowed down a little bit. And we see, fewer protesters coming out, fewer attention being paid to them, to the point where you don't really see them covered in national press or international press. Of course, at the beginning of the protest movement, you had thousands of young people going out protesting. There was quite a bit of chaos. There was also a more sustained movement of the protests in terms of people coming out more regularly than you see now, where it's petering out.
And what sparked the protests? What have been the underlying drivers behind why these people went out into the streets?
I would say that the major issue here for a lot of these protesters is this sort of discrepancy that you see in terms of government's treatment of big development plans and efficiency in service provision and ability to provide daily services for its citizens. And the biggest place where you see that is the momentum around the World Cup 2030 that Morocco is co-hosting with Spain and Portugal, where the country is investing billions of dollars to upgrade its stadium infrastructure, essentially to prepare for the World Cup. And on the other side of that, you have really aging public services that are not able to respond to the needs of citizens, particularly on the healthcare front and on the education front. So early on in September, you had a number of maternal deaths that were recorded in a hospital, particularly in Agadir. And that was really a big galvanizing event. And that was an event that drew a lot of people to the street to sort of say, look where we are. The government is spending billions of dollars on this particular investment, which a lot of people view as a prestige project versus, people dying while giving birth in hospitals in 2025. And that was essentially the biggest concern and the biggest driver.
What have the protesters been calling for? I mean, what sorts of slogans or chants have they been using? How have they been organizing themselves?
At the beginning of the protest movement, the protesters were calling for, better public service provision, as I mentioned, particularly on the healthcare system, better hospitals, more staff to run the hospitals. Essentially, people want the comfort of knowing that if you go to a hospital, you are going to get treated and your situation is not going to get worse at the very least because of inefficiencies inside the system. So I think that was the first thing. The second thing is better education. The education sector in Morocco has struggling over the past few years. Teachers have been embroiled in a number of challenges with the government regarding pay, regarding training, which have in some cases caused significant disruptions to school systems where you have, children essentially staying home for weeks and months on end because of the of teachers' strikes. So these were some of the two immediate demands of the protests. And then because of the initial crackdown that the government responded with, then you had sort of another set of demands that kind of cropped up, which is to the release of some of the people that were arrested after a lot of these early protests. I think at the moment there are something like 14,000 people that are awaiting trial on the back of these protests and arrests around the protest movement. So a massive crackdown, really, after the early few weeks of the protest movement. So this is right now where we are in terms of the demands, in addition to better governance, better public service provision, more accountability, more transparency. We also have demands for a release of people that were arrested.
And how did the protesters organize themselves?
There's a significant and heavy use of social media platforms, primarily Discord, use of these channels to organize, to plan protests, to come out to the streets and so forth. So social media is certainly a tool that the protesters are using to communicate with each other and to organize themselves.
How has the government responded? You certainly mentioned the crackdowns, arrests, but what have been some of the promises that the government has made in response as well?
Yeah, so there were, of course, certainly a number of the arrests early on. As I mentioned, thousands of people were swept up in some of these arrests. I think a lot of them have either already had their sentences announced or facing trials. And those tend to be fairly sort of heavy sentences. So you really see a heavy-handed government response at the very beginning. It took, I think, about 6 days or 7 days for the prime minister to actually come up with a response that was not just crackdown. And so after that, then you saw the prime minister call for dialogue. Then you saw some promises to spend more on healthcare, to build more hospitals, to essentially hire more teachers, more doctors, more nurses, etc. So you had some of these more concrete responses that didn't come out until a little bit later in the movement. And then the most sort of significant response right now is this call for young people to engage in politics and to try to sort of find a much more, let's say, institutionalized way for the protesters to join the political civic movements in Morocco, rather than just sort of remaining as a protest movement. But the protest movement, they continue to call for the release of the people that were arrested. And they are also continuing to call for, and I forgot to mention this earlier, the removal of the current government, change of the current government, even ahead of the election of 2026.
These are not the first protests that Morocco has seen, and during the 2017-2018 protests, the king himself, Mohammed VI, acknowledged that the tide of economic growth in Morocco has not lifted all boats equally, referring to what he called the quote, glaring paradoxes of Morocco's uneven development in his annual throne speech that year. 8 years on, how much has changed on that really kind of fundamental question?
The picture hasn't really changed from 2017 all that much. I mean, there's some progress on the margins, but the reality is that this big discrepancy between those in Morocco that have and those that have not continues. And so you see that in many ways. You see it certainly in lagging development indicators, in not a lot of investment going into sort of supporting different aspects of the population that are struggling and where there is a significant need. So, there's been a number of different efforts to try. This is not a new issue for Morocco. And the king is certainly aware of it, and he mentions it regularly, and he is always, trying to compel the political class to address it. Now, I think one of the maybe most, certainly there was 2017, as you mentioned, the speeches that came out. There was also right after that a significant effort to try to completely change the country's approach to human development through the New Development Model. The New Development Model was created after a long consensus phase that was launched, let's say, around 2018 and continued on until 2020. the government launched what was a very ambitious and really extremely well thought out human development and social development plan. The problem for Morocco is that the country does not generate enough economic activity and enough economic gain in order for them to actually finance and see all of that forward. There is that issue. There's the issue of limited economic growth that the country has still struggled to. There's another issue, which is a number of different priorities. So you have kind of a crowding of priorities and a crowding of needs. So you have a lot of priorities, for example, on the industrial front. Of course, the country wants to build build itself as an industrial hub, particularly one serving European markets, etc. So a lot of the money needs to go to creating that. It needs to go to that sort of infrastructure that would create more sort of industrial activity for the country. And not enough is going to serving the needs of the population, like building an effective hospital network system. Just to give you some details of this, there's public hospitals in Morocco. And then there are private hospitals, and then there are these sort of semi-public hospitals and clinics. Everyone understands that if they go to a public hospital in Morocco, you're essentially taking your life into your hands because the public hospital system is really weak. And I am talking about just really glaring needs, like, for example, not enough hospital beds, not enough basic hospital machinery and things that you would expect to see in a normal hospital. So there really is a significant need. And then, of course, you have the either private or semi-private institutions where people tend to go. If they can afford to spend money to go there, that's a big question. And then once even you spend money to go there, it's not guaranteed that you are going to get a decent level of healthcare. There's this real issue with public services like healthcare and education that really have not been able to meet the needs of both the citizens and even the country itself.
But to the point that you raised earlier about the kind of pockets of real kind of progress or investment in particular areas in the economy, in manufacturing areas, you think of course, Morocco with auto manufacturing, the aerospace sector, where they've had real successes, but also not necessarily big employers. So it doesn't necessarily move the needle on the kind of general perception of the population about prospects for growth, for employment opportunities, and that sort of thing as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly, you look at a lot of the areas where Morocco is betting on for their economic growth. You have a number of sort of standout sectors. You have the automotive sector, you have the aerospace sector, and then you have the renewable energy sectors. These are all sectors that Morocco understands that they have sort of an advantage there because of their proximity to European markets, because of their ability to kind of provide easy access to European producers and European consumers as well. But the problem is a lot of these sectors don't necessarily employ to the scale that the country needs. So, they create employment in very sort of limited specific areas. The way that these industries work now is that they use a lot of automation. So if you go to some of these very impressive plants that you have in Morocco, whether it's in Tangier or elsewhere, some of the other economic zones, etc., you will see a lot of machinery. You will see a lot of technology that is being used, and you will see less labor is required. Now, that does not mean that these sectors don't create employment. They do create employment, but they create often a sort of employment that Morocco is still trying to build. For example, they need engineers, they need technicians, and this is something that Morocco has more recently tried to work on, to try to do this technical education programs that will create these types of working class. But then again, this remains fairly limited. So there really has to be a much bigger economic growth and opening across a number of different sectors so that you can have higher employment rates and you can have more opportunities spread across the board.
Wanted to turn back to the younger generation of Moroccans who have been the main force behind the protests from last month. How did they see prospects for their future? Is it anxiety, pessimism, frustration, hope, some combination?
I think a lot of anxiety and pessimism, I would say more than hope. It's difficult, right? It's difficult for these younger people. They are growing as part of, let's say, a global generation that is facing a lot of anxiety in general about, their economic future, about a lot of the economic stresses that they've faced in the aftermath of the global pandemic. And then, of course, there's bigger environmental concerns. There's a lot of that. And then all of that is really compounded for a country like Morocco, where you have, and it's not just Morocco, it's a lot of other countries where you see this, where there is a sense of sort of uh, lost opportunity and waste because they see their country, and they kind of understand that the country has a lot of potential, but for, I don't know, maybe for political reasons, maybe for other reasons, that potential does not seem to be reached. So you see a lot of pessimism, and I think one of the areas where you can see a lot of that pessimism is the high rates of migration, particularly illegal migration towards places like Europe, where not only, are you more likely to have a better job if you are someone with an education as a doctor or as a teacher, but even as a younger person, you have a higher opportunity to get a more decent education and to get a more decent life if you go to some of these places. So I think that's one of the areas where you really can see the migration rates, the higher migration rates, sort of reflecting the popular attitude and the popular perception of the futures of the country's own economic future.
And we should also point out that Morocco is a young country overall. That is still a growing population, and the groups that were involved in the protests, if really anyone under the age of 35 makes up more than half of the entire population of Morocco. What impact does that have on the government's own calculations in terms of the kind of development that it needs to do and needs to deliver on?
Well, look, I think the government understands that they need to do more, and they need to make sure that there's not a significant discrepancy, both in terms of perception, but also in terms of narrative, rhetoric, and also in terms of reality as well, between how they develop the country's economy moving forward. Because those are necessary things to do, certainly. I mean, Morocco needs to figure out how it's going to build a competitive economy for itself, given that it's a small country and given that it's a country that does not have a lot of resources, etc. But Morocco does need to figure out a better way to combine its economic ambition with genuine improvements to governance and particularly service provision. Because what the country is doing on the economic front, in terms of trying to come up with a very good economic vision and trying to build on it and trying to figure out a way to become competitive and to become not only competitive but also prosperous in the current global context, is a great thing and a fantastic thing. It should remain a priority. I think the challenge for the Moroccan government is to figure out how to do that while also delivering on the governance and particularly on the public service provision part of the equation. And that's something that they have been very inconsistent with. And I think part of the reason why we see the expectations kind of as high as they are is that the narrative from, the Moroccan government and a number of other governments, if you see kind of in the lead up to the global pandemic, etc., there was this sort of shifting, let's say, relationship between citizens and society. You have this implicit promise that was made by the government towards citizens in the aftermath of all of the turmoil and all of the changes that 2011 brought, to essentially focus more on providing better governance, better services, better economic well-being in exchange for, let's say, silence, let's say, patience. So I would argue that a lot of these promises really focused on improvements to these areas. And of course, the promises have not lived up to the results that we see.
So to the point that you were kind of alluding to toward the end, one of the promises that the government made in response to the protests was to open up the candidacy requirements for next year's elections. To what degree do you think that younger Moroccans see politics or taking part in the legislative process as something that will actually improve everyday life for them or for their families? Will they run next year, for example?
Yeah, well, it seems to be that this is what the government has settled on in terms of how to try to overcome this movement or this moment of political mobilization. Is to essentially say to young people, look, why don't you just engage in politics and political life? And that's sort of, that's kind of been their response. That's something that they're trying to channel not only through official to kind of discourse, and that's what the prime minister is saying. That's what cabinet members are saying. But you also have let's say mosque sermons essentially saying the same thing to people. If you have a grievance, go and engage in politics. Look, I think it's very difficult to convince young Moroccans to engage in politics when the entire kind of political system is not all that appealing. You have a number of political parties. These political parties, the role that they play in everyday politics is limited compared to the role that the monarchy plays. And of course, it's not only just as simple as, run for an election and next thing you know, you're going to be sort of shaping how the government works. It's essentially run for an election and you're going to be bogged down in political processes and all of these things that don't necessarily have much to do with kind of steering the course of the government. So it's an attempt. I don't think it's a very appealing attempt, but it's another attempt to try and sort of silence kind of these demands, or at least to try to channel these demands into something a little bit more concrete. Because then, what else will you do? Otherwise, you will continue to deal with this sort of diffuse, sort of ill-defined movement that is calling for general changes and reforms without anything concrete. And at that point, no matter what you do as a government, it's not going to be enough to meet expectations. So if anything, I would say it's a smart move on the side of the government. I don't know the extent to which it's going to change the sentiment, but it's certainly a smart move.
One thing you mentioned earlier is the fact that the Gen Z 212 protests are part of a recent wave of youth protest movements around the world. I mean, we have similar kinds of mass movements in Nepal, Madagascar, Bangladesh, Kenya. We've also seen some intense environmental protests last month in neighboring Tunisia. How closely are younger demonstrators paying attention to each other via social media, whether to learn from each other's approaches or as inspiration? And how have such links influenced or shaped the protests that we saw in Morocco specifically?
Look, it's inevitable, right? I mean, we live in a very, very interconnected world, and I think it's very difficult to sort of say what happens in one place is not something that anyone else is paying attention to. I think certainly, especially when it comes to these kind of things. I mean, you see what happened in Nepal and what happened in Madagascar. And that's extremely, it's extremely, let's say, can be extremely inspiring if that's what you are looking for. I think for the Moroccan movement, yes, they look and they see the power of mobilization. And I think the power of mobilization has been a recurring sort of thing since 2011. If the ballot box fails you, if the government does not listen to what you want, protests will always get you more attention. And I think that's a lesson that we see again and again and again kind of being internalized by populations across the world, not just only in North Africa or Morocco. But I will say that when it comes to how these sort of movements are organizing, what they're asking for, the extent to which they shape their demands to their particular environments is very unique, is quite unique to their own circumstances. So I would say yes. Watching a galvanizing movement happen in another country, especially if it's, I don't know, a francophone country, one that is potentially closer, etc., can help. But then ultimately, the ceilings of the demand or the nature of the demand is very much going to be dictated by what you have on the ground. And that's what you see in the Gen Z 212 in Morocco in terms of what they're asking for. They're not asking for a total change in political structure. They're not asking for a dismantling of the regime. They're not asking for anything like that. They're asking for better accountability. They're asking for better services. They're asking for less corruption. They're asking for a response to very immediate and frankly legitimate needs.
I want to turn next to kind of the longer term outlook moving forward. You touched on earlier how the numbers involved in the protests seem to be ebbing. And I wonder, these sort of protests, which are by design decentralized, can they really be sustained without either clear leadership or support from other existing social actors like political parties, like unions, civil society groups, that sort of thing?
No, I mean, it certainly requires that kind of confluence that you are talking about, whether it's support from more established political actors or feeding into a much, a more sort of, let's say, official or sustainable channel for change. I think at least the way I see the Moroccan protests playing out is that right now, or let's say last month, they happened, but they didn't happen sort of in kind of a normal year. Next year there's going to be parliamentary elections in Morocco. I think more and more there was a narrative in Morocco from this government that was very, let's say, self-congratulatory about what they have been able to achieve economically. And I think they deserve a lot of credit, but I think they were essentially beginning to lose sight of the fact that there was still a lot of need when it comes to the population. And I think the protests will serve as a reminder of that. So at the very least, you are going to have the protests driving a more humbling of political forces, particularly the current leading political forces into the next electoral campaign. So I would say that there's that. I think it also helps to maintain a level of pressure on officials, especially if the election doesn't necessarily move them to, let's say, do better and deliver on their campaign promises. So having that lever, that extra lever of pressure and accountability, public accountability, is, I think, important. So I see this kind of playing out in the next election. We already see a lot more sort of engagement from the opposition. I think for a lot of political actors, they're very careful not to straightforwardly endorse the protests. Again, to some extent, because of the chaotic nature at the very beginning of the protest movement. But I think you already see the protest movement has injected a degree of sort of activity and engagement. If you saw some of the debate in Morocco that's happening around the new budget law and budget allocation, you will see a lot more sort of active engagement and the real process by which politics are supposed to work. And I think for Morocco, particularly since the election of this current government, we sort of lost that a little bit because this government came in and after 2020, 2021, really sort of, the government and the population was reeling from the post-pandemic impact. And so they really came with this broad consensus, and a lot of political support for them to try and turn the situation around. And so I think you saw a little bit less willingness to sort of kind of go to toe to toe with them, et cetera. But I think you see that changing a little bit. So I think at the very least, these protests will inject a little bit more dynamism in the upcoming election.
You've touched on the elections a few times, but I just kind of want to drill down on this in a little bit more detail. How do you see it changing the sort of landscape? Do you see it affecting the kinds of issues that parties are running on, the types of candidates they're running? I just wanted to kind of draw you out on that a little bit more.
I think we have to remember that when it comes to real political change in Morocco, it doesn't necessarily come from the political parties. It comes from the monarchy and it comes from the king and it comes from the sort of decision-making entourage or body around the king and within the monarchy as an institution itself. So with that caveat, yes, I think you will probably see more political parties vying, paying closer attention to what the needs of the population are, etc. I think there's sometimes this dichotomy in Moroccan politics that's kind of difficult to understand from the outside, which is that the political parties don't necessarily only serve their constituents. They also serve the monarchy and the king. And so you kind of have always almost this sort of effort to try to consolidate both of these aspects of who does the political party serve. And so do you pay attention to what your constituency needs? Do you ultimately just essentially implement the orders that are coming from the more kind of executive bodies, etc. And so I think that can create some tension. So I think at least what I would expect is that the fact that you have a population that has demands, that has expectations, might compel politicians and political parties to pay closer attention to the needs of the population. But to be very frank, I mean, we are talking about changes on the margins. We're not talking about changes in a significant way. I think those all will be sort of with the monarchy and the king's own vision for the country.
That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you, Intissar, for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me.
A warm thanks also to our listeners for tuning in, as well as to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode.
To find MEI's latest coverage of Morocco and the rest of North Africa, please visit our website, www.mei.edu. You can also follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events.
I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. We hope you listen in again next week.